What it is, I am Controlled Pairs, and this is Controlled Pairs Gaming. Thank you for tuning into the video today. This is the latest installment in the Kerbal Space Program for Dummies tutorial series. Today we are going to teach you how to take a craft to the moon, safely land on the moon, and then return safely to Kerbin. Now, this tutorial series is designed to help you tackle a series of challenges. We've already covered how to achieve orbit, as well as how to land safely back on planet Kerbin, generally where you want to. If you haven't watched those tutorials, I suggest you do those first. However, if you've conquered those tutorials, you are in the right place, because today we are taking you to your first major challenge and actually landing on another planetary body, the moon. Now you see here the Mooner Tutor, that is the craft I've designed for this tutorial, is designed into three main parts. That is a landing part, a landing phase, a cruise phase, as well as a launch phase. I'm not going to go specifically through how to construct this thing. However, there will be a file in the description that you may download and then drag into your save on your machine so that you can fly along in this tutorial just like I did. If you do need some instructions on how to construct a vessel capable of going to the moon, let me know in the description. I'll be happy to take a little bit more time next time to go into how to actually design this thing. Let's head out to the launch pad with the Mooner Tutor and get ready to actually go to the moon. I know this is exciting. A lot of you guys haven't been able to do this before. We're going to walk you through it from start to finish. It's going to take about 20 minutes. Just bear with me, and I hope you learned something from it. So once you get out here to the launch pad, click R to activate your RCS and T to activate SAS. Throttle up to about 50% and then hit spacebar to activate your craft. Next, we're going to go through those same launching procedures as you learned in the very first video that we did, how to achieve orbit. First, we're going to accelerate, going straight up. We will continue this vertical ascent until those solid rocket boosters on the bottom of our launch stage are completely drained, which is happening right now. As soon as those are drained, fully accelerate by pressing Z on the keyboard and hit spacebar in order to separate those solid rocket boosters. Now start pitching over using the D key on your keyboard to begin your gravity turn. Remember, at about 20,000 meters of altitude, we want to have achieved approximately a 45-degree ascent profile. You see here that as I begin my gravity turn, the craft begins to shake. You can prevent that by doing several things, including adding additional struts to stabilize it, but in this case, all I did was deactivate the SAS by pressing T on the keyboard, and it allows me a little bit more control. I do have to pilot manually and have to fight it a little bit, but it stops the shaking, and that's highly beneficial, because if it shakes too much, well, then the craft is going to completely fall apart. So, as we continue to ascend, we finish our launch stage off completely. It runs out of fuel. We hit spacebar to separate the stage, and I reactivate SAS because now that our craft is a little bit smaller, it is easier to control. We've crossed well over that 20,000 meter altitude mark that is all important, and we are continuing our gravity turn and picking up speed. You see now that I've pitched almost all the way over to where we're just about horizontal with the horizon. Now the throttle is still maxed out, and I'm still increasing my orbit speed, that horizontal velocity, with respect to the ground. On the right side, you see flight engineers telling us that our apoapsis height is exceeding 80,000 meters. That's a mod. You don't have that mod, so instead you're going to have to hit M on your keyboard and monitor your apoapsis. For the purposes of going to the moon, I usually push my apoapsis height to about 100 kilometers, above the surface of Kerbin, as you see here. Once you've achieved an apoapsis height of 100 kilometers, go ahead and click on your apoapsis and then add a maneuver node like we covered in our orbital series. Next, use the retrograde vector on that maneuver node to extend your apsis to 100 kilometers above the surface of Kerbin as well, so that we can successfully circularize. Once you've established that good maneuver node that will circularize your orbit at least 100 kilometers above the surface of Kerbin, monitor your estimated burn time and fast forward until you get to the maneuver node. You here see our estimated burn time is approximately 29 seconds. That means we need to initiate our burn 15 seconds before T time, and it will continue until approximately 15 seconds after T time. Now that we are in the air, out of the air, we can also extend our solar panels, so we'll begin soaking up that sunlight, which will allow us to maintain an electric charge and power our spacecraft. I recommend that you do the same as soon as you're out of the atmosphere. As soon as we hit 15 seconds before our burn time, that is T time, 0 T time, whatever the hell it is, we initiate our burn. That's a 30-second burn. You can see we began it 15 seconds prior to T, and it completed almost exactly 15 seconds after T. And we go to check our circularization, and sure enough, we are circularized right around 100 kilometers above the surface of Kerbin, just as we intended. Next, what you're going to do is zoom out on your map, click on the moon, and set it as a target. This will make it yellow. Now you see those two dotted lines that are extending from Kerbin out to the moon. Those two dotted lines represent a position on your orbit called the ascending node and the descending node. These represent the difference between your plane orbit versus the moon's plane orbit. So imagine a two-dimensional plane, a table or a floor extending completely across your orbit out to the moon. We want to make sure that both the plane of your orbit as well as the plane of the moon's orbit are in line. In order to do this, we add another maneuver node at either the ascending or the descending node, and we want to decrease that ascending and descending node from 1.5 degrees, which is what it was, down to 0 degrees. This will put us on the exact same plane as the moon. So we've scheduled that burn, we've put the maneuver node there. It's only going to be a 1-second burn, so we're not going to waste too much fuel in the process, and it's going to be pretty easy to do this successfully. So I go ahead and use time acceleration to move all the way over to the ascending node. And as soon as we get there, we start to slow down, being very careful not to overshoot it. And as soon as we hit 1 second, I press Z to activate my engines at 100% and X to terminate it. As always, I maximize the throttle of my engines until there's only a second or less, usually a fraction of a second, left in my burn, and then I just gently press the shift key to increase the throttle enough to complete that orbital maneuver. Now that we've finished making sure that we are completely within the same plane as the moon, we are ready to schedule our transfer burn. This part is a little bit more tricky, so we want to identify the moon in the solar system and then add a maneuver node that is going to allow us to extend our orbit all the way out until there is an intersection with the moon. As you add that prograde burn, you'll see two little white chevrons appear on that yellow orbit line that the moon is on. As soon as those two white chevrons are aligned, that means that your spacecraft will intersect with the moon. So this takes a little bit of practice, and there's no perfect way to do it. As a general rule, you're going to have to put that burn on the opposite side of the planet of the moon. So if you're orbiting around planet Kerbin, imagine the moon coming over the horizon in a moonrise, and that is a general indicator of when you will have to start the lunar burn. Once you schedule that orbital maneuver using a maneuver node, and you have a good intersection, tinker with it until your perapsis or your apoapsis with respect to the moon is below 100,000 kilometers. This will mean that you have to perform less maneuvers once you actually get close to the moon. Here you see I actually put mine at less than 10 kilometers above the surface of the moon. That's kind of a risky maneuver, and I definitely suggest that you use 10 kilometers as a bare minimum, meaning you can go no lower than 10 kilometers safely, because there are mountain peaks on the moon that actually reach up to close to 10K, and I could theoretically run into them. So we begin our transfer burn. We use up the rest of the fuel in that cruise stage. I separate the stage and continue my burn by activating all of the other engines in the landing phase. Here we have about 8 seconds left in the burn, and it's a burn just like all others. You want to start at approximately 50% before tea time and end it approximately 50% after. If you were watching carefully, you saw that I overshot the maneuver node. Don't do that. It ends up wasting a ton of fuel and potentially completely screwing up your transfer burn. So you see there that the moon perapsis is right now right about 100K. I'm just giving the spacecraft a teeny bit of fuel because I saw that every time I gave it a little bit of fuel, I was decreasing the perapsis. So I put it underneath 10K, which is risky, but it's going to end up helping us land a lot faster for the sake of this video, so I can keep it a little bit shorter. Plus, it's exciting. So as soon as you get that good intersection with the moon, go ahead and hit F5 on your keyboard in order to save your progress. If at any time you make a mistake in the mission, or you overshoot your target, or you crash, or you run out of fuel, all you have to do is press F9 and hold it down, and it will take you back to wherever you hit F5 and used the quick save feature. Now we've encountered the moon, and we are within the moon's sphere of influence. I time accelerate until I get to that apoapsis, the peak of that lunar ellipse in our orbit. As soon as we get to the apoapsis, I extend my landing legs by hitting G on the keyboard, and I orient retrograde. So now we are going way too fast, and if we don't brake, we're going to fly right past the moon, and our mission will be completely failed. As soon as we get to that apoapsis, orient retrograde as you see me and as I just did, and then fire your engines to reduce your speed. You see the camera changed. That's because we did what's called capturing the moon. Whenever you're going to do a flyby of a planetoid and you reduce your speed enough that you achieve an orbit around it, that's called capturing the planet. So in this case, we captured the moon. If we were to kill our rockets right now, kill our thrust right now, we could safely orbit the moon indefinitely. But we're here to land today, so we're going to continue decelerating by firing our engines. You see those 3 small engines on the outside are completely out of fuel. That's okay, they were actually designed to pump fuel from those small tanks into the main tank with the main engine. And we still have plenty of fuel to safely land and return home. So now we're only moving about 90 meters per second over the surface of the moon, so we're well within control. You see here that I jumped into the cockpit by pressing C. I'm looking at that gauge right there, the radar altitude, and I see that my altitude is now 2,000 meters above the surface of the moon. This is a good way to gauge your actual altitude. If you look at the top of the screen, it says that I'm still 6,500 meters above the surface of the moon. But in reality, there's peaks and valleys and craters all over the moon, so you have to monitor those gauges inside the cockpit in order to determine how close you actually are to the surface of the moon. Now you see I also looked up and checked exactly where the sun was with respect to my aircraft and the surface of the moon. That was to tell where my shadow would be. So then I looked down, having determined exactly where that shadow was likely to be, and I watched until it appeared. This gives me a very good representation of exactly when I'll make contact and be able to land. As you continue to lower yourself down, continue decelerating by using the throttle. Whenever your landing legs actually touch the ground, you want to make sure that you're traveling less than 5 meters per second, or you'll risk breaking them. So as we get closer, you see that I continue to accelerate, reducing my speed to below 5 meters per second. But that retrograde marker on the nav ball starts to get away from me, and as a result, I come down a little bit too fast, and I actually almost completely tip over. This is something that you'll have to practice. In order to come down nice and soft every single time, it's something that you just have to do a few times to get the feel of it. So here we are, having landed successfully on the moon. Once you get here, you can detach your rover, or go on EVA, collect samples, plant a flag, whatever you usually do, or whatever the whole purpose of your mission was. But we're not here for that, we're here to finish the tutorial. So now that we've landed, I look on the left side of the screen to determine that my staging is still good to go. At the exact same time, I hit Z on the keyboard to completely maximize my throttle, and spacebar in order to detach those excess fuel tanks with the landing legs because I no longer needed them. Now you want to take off, orient horizontally in pretty much any direction that you want, and then begin gaining speed. Here you see I took off and oriented at 270 degrees or west. Now I'm gaining horizontal velocity because in order to go home, we need to increase our velocity enough that we escape the sphere of influence that is emitted by the moon. So every body in Kerbal Space Program has mass and uses gravity. So in order to get completely away from the moon, we have to increase our speed in order to escape its gravitational pull and leave orbit with the moon. Escape velocity for the moon is right around 750 meters per second. So you'll see that as soon as I hit 750 meters per second, I am no longer projected to completely re-encounter the moon after I go to the top of my orbit. As soon as I reach escape velocity, I go ahead and use time acceleration in order to get back in orbit around Kerbin, even though it's an incredibly high orbit. So now that we're in orbit around Kerbin, I'm going to once again time accelerate to either the apsis or the apoapsis in order to conduct a retrograde burn that will put us close to the surface of the planet so that we can return home. You always want to conduct your orbital mechanics at either the apoapsis or the apsis because they're the most efficient way of using your fuel. As you can see, we have less than 25 units of liquid fuel left, and so every little drop that we have is precious and we need to make sure that we're efficient with it. Now that we've reached our apoapsis, the highest point of our orbit, I go ahead and orient retrograde and begin a burn that reduces the perapsis. We're going to bring that perapsis down until it's just under 15 kilometers above the surface of Kerbin, just like we showed you how to do in the previous video. In this case, I actually accelerated too much, and it resulted in an orbit that would have caused me to intersect with Kerbin and crash into the surface, a suborbital trajectory. So in order to fix that, I reorient myself prograde and fire the engines just a tad to increase that perapsis to about 15 kilometers above the surface. Now that we're getting closer to the planet, I oftentimes forget to retract my solar panels, but it turns out that the solar panels that I put on this craft don't retract anyway. For future reference, whenever you do have solar panels on a vessel, make sure that you can both extend them and retract them so that they don't get completely destroyed upon re-entry. So we time accelerate again as we return to Kerbin, and if we wanted to, we have just enough fuel and monopropellant left that we might have a chance of successfully landing at Kerbal Space Center. But I did this all in one tank, and I just wanted to get back so I could keep the length of the video a little bit shorter. So before we detach our final stage, I go ahead and fire the engines to reduce our velocity and hopefully save some of the ablator on our heat shield and reduce our speed just a little bit more. As soon as I run that tank completely dry, we separate the stage. Once we've separated the stage, all that's left to do is complete our re-entry. You see that the re-entry profile we've selected is similar to the same one that we used during the surviving re-entry video. In this case, as soon as you start to get heating effects, you want to turn off your SAS and your RCS and let gravity take over. So long as that you have a symmetrical craft that is well balanced, the bottom of that capsule is going to stay oriented in the correct direction throughout the entire re-entry process. The only time that you'll need to engage SAS and RCS is if you've created something that is not symmetrical or somehow top heavy and it wants to face the wrong direction. This is often the case with space planes. However, in this tutorial, for the vessel we created that went to the moon and returned, it is completely unnecessary to do so. You see that the solar panels broke off. Just a reminder once again to attach solar panels that you can extend and retract, not ones that just extend, particularly if you're going to use career mode. Now all we have to do is finish surviving the re-entry and monitoring our descent. You can see that the ablator indicated in the top right has decreased from 200 to 164. So while we got heating effects and we did get some heating on the heat shield, it was nowhere near enough to actually threaten the survival of the command capsule and Jebediah Kerman inside. Now that those heating effects have completely gone away, we're watching our speed with respect to the surface. As soon as it decreases below 300 meters per second, we are safe to deploy our parachute. Once the parachute is deployed, you can time accelerate until it is actually going to fill with air. Before we launched, I made sure my parachute was set to deploy at 500 meters above sea level. Now that we're actually descending, I want to make sure that I stop time accelerating before we reach 500 meters above sea level when that parachute deploys. Sometimes the physics engine actually causes the parachutes to completely detach if you are time accelerating at the time that the parachute actually fills up with air, like it just did. Now that it's safely deployed and we continue to reduce our descent, we can jump in the cockpit with Jebediah Kerman, having safely left the Kerbal Space Center, landed on the moon, and returned to planet Kerbin. Thanks for tuning in to today's video. I hope you found it useful. If you were able to actually get to the moon as a result of this video, let me know in the comments below, and congratulations. I know that's a big step for anyone who plays KSP. Next time we're going to teach you how to dock while in orbit around Kerbin and build space stations, a really cool skill to have. And until next time, this is Controlled Pairs, signing off.